Welcome to Forthright and my first test of the Substack audio podcast format, which seems appropriate given the subject of last week's column, published April 11, 2024 in the Spokesman Review, herewith a column with commentary titled Measuring the Sound of Silence. In an area where the tallest structures are grain elevators, industrial wind turbines are more than simply a disturbance to the rural skyline. They are transformative. Modern turbines are 600 to 650 feet tall. They change a rural landscape into an urban one. As one neighbor put it, if I wanted to look at tall buildings and blinking lights, I'd move to the city. Modern wind turbines are taller than the Space Needle, twice the height of downtown Spokane's Bank of America building, and 6 times taller than the average grain elevator. That's 2 football fields, including the end zones. Industrial wind turbines are massive, and there's never just one. Developers in Lincoln and Whitman counties are talking about 40 or 50 or 75 turbines per project. Besides the visual disturbance, they bring with them the low thrum of noise, disturbing the sound of silence. The tension in rural communities is exacerbated by the number of parcels owned by out-of-county investors, trusts, and charities. Absentee landowners will never feel the impacts, but do reap financial benefits from leasing access to multinational energy corporations who are farming billions in tax credits. Tenant farmers are in a tough spot, some afraid to speak out because they fear losing their agricultural leases, while having to farm around turbines and the roads that connect them less efficiently. Or a local landowner might be seeking a way to resist increasing development pressures to subdivide agricultural land for housing. Farmers looking for ways to diversify crops for greater resilience as grain prices rise and fall might decide planting turbines is a positive addition to their business plan. They understand the risk of no-fly zones inhibiting firefighting efforts because their houses are on the line too. Balancing the financial and social trade-offs is a heart-wrenching dilemma, but at least they literally have skin in the game. Governor Jay Inslee's remarks to the UN Climate Conference in 2022 dismissed opposition simplistically as not in my backyard, saying regulatory reform was needed to overcome it. The Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council was formed in 1970 and became an independent agency in 2022 to provide an alternative to bothersome local permitting processes. After being asked if Inslee stood by his remarks, his spokesman Mike Falk said in an email, "The governor sees a dichotomy between legitimate concerns about potential siting impacts and those who simply oppose clean energy for the sake of opposing clean energy, i.e. NIMBYism." Well, it's easy to dismiss anyone who isn't a decarbonization cheerleader as just a NIMBY, but there are legitimate questions about the life cycle of industrial wind energy facilities and how clean they really are. There are equally legitimate questions on the deadly conflict between wind turbines and the eagles and other wildlife. So how much is a dead eagle worth? Quote, in environmental ethics, a key term is intrinsic value. Some would argue all living things have intrinsic value and others have instrumental value based on their utility. The risk is saying all values need to be characterized instrumentally, end quote, said Brian Henning, professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University and a frequent writer on the ethics of environmental decision-making. Quote, how do we go about designing a future recognizing both kinds of value instead of reducing them all to economic measures? That's a fair concern and a complex one, end quote. We value what we can measure, and we can't measure the value of an eagle or the value of quiet, open quote. People who love the wilderness, places not dominated by human sounds and human structure would understand. Rural communities may have the same response, Henning said, but we must insist on a cost-benefit analysis, and then we're only looking at the number of bodies affected, end quote. It's the noise, the unwanted sound, that causes health issues. There's over a decade of peer-reviewed studies on the health effects of noise from wind turbines. The degree of impact is related to the setback distance, terrain, temperature, sound characteristics, and decibel level at each specific residence. Health impacts are also related to perceptions of fairness and community control. Impacts are greater when local decision-making is trumped by an appeal to an outside permitting process like the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council. Henning agreed the question is one of environmental justice. Quote, statistically, if you're poor, you're more likely to live in a community that's polluted. In a fair community, how much money is in your wallet shouldn't affect your environment, end quote. He said, residents in rural counties where the median income is less than half of King County's question the fairness of mining Eastern Washington's rural environment for Western Washington's urban energy. Why not wind turbines in backyards on the other side of the Cascades? Quote, that's a fair response, Henning said. If communities in Seattle are benefiting from energy, they should have to do it too, end quote. And in Seattle, wind turbines wouldn't disturb the sound of silence. Well, there's a fair bit of reader feedback from David, a friend I've known for a long time, about your piece regarding wind turbines. They have bothered me too, especially down the Oregon Gorge. Technology often offers the solution to the problem it created and goes on to making it worse. Nice article. Thanks, David. I understand the economic upside to my neighbors, and if I was convinced they really are as wonderful as many believe they are, I could probably get used to them. But based on my own research into the life cycle cost analyses that have been done, they aren't clean. They still rely on petroleum products for operation and maintenance, and I place a high intrinsic value on silence and dark skies. From Jim, the sound of silence begins in the West Wing of the White House, where hypocrisy knows no bounds. Keep pushing. And he sent a link to a story published in The Hill. That link is included in the Substack bibliography, highlighting the Biden administration action to make it cheaper to develop wind and solar energy on public lands. Any other kind of industrial development would draw immediate criticism for the damage to the environment. But because the true believers in the climate alarm camp are convinced anything that isn't burning fossil fuels must be clean and green, opposition will be muted, questions will not be asked, and the trade-offs will not be discussed. A couple of days after publication, I received this thoughtful response, signed from Glenn and Cheryl. It's written by Glenn. Quote, I have a couple of comments about your article in the paper about the noise coming from windmills. My wife and I both enjoy sleeping at night with a certain amount of noise from a fan in our bedroom, which I cannot believe it is any noisier than standing underneath a tall windmill being used to generate electricity. My wife and I have often talked about how it would not bother us at all to have a certain size and shape of windmill in our community or in our neighborhood or even in our backyard that would produce electricity. We also were able to tour a windmill farm in Palm Springs, California. The person that guided us through the wind farm was very knowledgeable and assured us that bird strikes were few and not common at all, and he felt that the bird strikes were overstated and overexaggerated. I tried thinking back to what the noise was like while we were standing in that windmill farm, and I really don't remember any noise that would bother anyone. I would take a wind farm over another nuclear plant or a coal-fired plant for electricity. We even enjoy looking at the wind farms as we drive by them, heading from Spokane to Seattle, which we do often. Well, I really appreciate hearing from folks like this couple, because encouraging to stop and think is why I keep writing and why I keep podcasting. But let me take those points separately. One, driving past wind farms on the way to, on the route between Spokane and Seattle is different than living with them. And so there's not really a comparison there. We're talking about the sighting that affects people who are living with them. On getting used to the noise, absolutely. People can get used to any kind of noise. I grew up in Spokane. I lived in student housing in Pullman and then in a small town next to the railroad, the grain elevators, and a state highway for almost 20 years. I was used to the town noise, like Glenn and Cheryl are used to the fan in the bedroom. When my husband and I moved to the countryside almost 30 years ago, at first I actually found the silence a bit unnerving, broken only by the sound of the train whistle at the crossing 2 miles away, or the church bells from the village 3 miles away, or the wind or the sounds of farming in their brief seasons. But I came to really value it. And then we moved into a house with the Burlington Northern Main Line tracks to Seattle running about 540 feet from our bedroom window. Again, I've lived near railroads my whole adult life. We're between two major crossings, and now I can distinguish whether the train whistle is a freight or Amtrak's Empire Builder, maybe once an hour, and I treasure the silence more every time I return from time in a city. Landscapes are about more than what we see, but about what we hear or don't hear. And how do you put a price on a glorious night sky unmarred by red warning lights? And that's why this is a decision about trade-offs. Who's being asked to sacrifice, and do they have control or meaningful input into sighting, setbacks, and noise levels? And that's why the characteristics of the sound make a difference. An occasional train whistle once an hour is just like the cuckoo clock going off in the kitchen. It's a timekeeper. It's just very brief and doesn't really interrupt anything. It's different than a constant thrum. But that meaningful input is also why, in one meta study I read recently on the human impact of sound, is that people who were involved in the decisions were less likely to find higher noise levels objectionable or to have physical reactions due to the potential to disrupt sleep cycles. And people who were collecting income from the wind turbines had the least impact. They had mostly adapted, but they were receiving both the benefits and the nuisance. And so they were accepting a trade-off. About the birds, let me just say I would trust information on bird strike deaths from someone benefiting financially from wind turbines about as much as I would trust reassurances from the airports that the PFAS levels in Spokane really aren't all that bad and the levels could be higher. I mean, there's good reason we have government oversight of all manner of pollution created by companies who are naturally going to look out for their self-interest. I expect nothing less and nothing more from them. FSEC, the state permitting agency, has been around since the first nuclear era ended in the Whoops debacle. It became a council without a purpose when the nuclear industry collapsed and then was repurposed to support Governor Inslee's green energy agenda, specifically to override local community planning and permitting. But FSEC, in its recent decision in a Benton County case, has started to look at trade-offs too and has recommended cutting back that project by about half to protect endangered hawks, view sheds, aerial firefighting access, and recreational uses. The governor could choose to accept the FSEC recommendations or blow off their advice and approve the whole project. We'll have to see which way the wind blows out of Olympia. So please take the time to subscribe on Substack for email notification of new content, whether you make a pledge or not. Working on Substack is like being a street musician with an instrument case open. If there's value, if you are entertained or educated, feel free to drop a few dollars in the case. And thanks for listening.